good a DJ voice, I've been told. So, good morning. Welcome, everybody. You're very welcome to Denver, Colorado. You arrived on a beautiful sunny day. I understand that will deteriorate later in the week, so you have something to look forward to and experience. I'm really pleased and honored to chair this next session on the geopolitics of the energy transition, and we have a distinguished panel, some of whom I've known for almost 20 years, like Wim, and so it's a nice chance to meet old friends. And I think what we're going to do is have each panelist give sort of a 10-minute opening salvo, and then we'll make time for conversation and questions. So without further ado, Amy Jaffe, who I believe is known to many of you, she runs the energy program at the Council on Foreign Relations and has a distinguished career that I will not go into. Thank you. And Amy, the floor is yours.
Well, that's great. Just so you all know, I'm your president-elect as well, so have to listen very carefully to my rocks. No, just kidding. It's really a pleasure to be here and with Morgan and the other panelists, all of whom I've worked with and not on?
Now you are, yeah. Just move it closer.
I have appeared, I think, with everybody on this panel on multiple occasions, so it's always an honor to be able to get back together and have a dialogue. I know that the other panelists have a very strong technical and modeling background to the subject, so I was going to be more provocatively geopolitical in my remarks and move away from sort of the academic framework for a few minutes just to get us started and put some of the other comments in context. So a lot of people write, and many of you in the audience, I'm sure, and Morgan has, very highly skilledly written about the geopolitics of the minerals and other components that are going to go into the materials of new energy. And a colleague of mine from UT, Joshua Busby, did a great piece for my website on the role that electricity coercion could play someday in geopolitics. But I'm actually going to focus my remarks on what is going to happen to the oil industry in light of the energy transition and what kind of geopolitics might emanate from that. Because we can start to actually see some of that taking shape, which is a little shocking because we're all debating, is it going to be 2 decades from now or 3 decades from now, or there's probably some people in the audience who think it's never. So the fact that it's already manifesting itself in corporate and sovereign behavior, I think, is sort of an interesting place to begin our conversation. So I always tell people, for my early days in the oil and gas industry as a writer, it was always explained to me that we're working from a scarcity paradigm, that the oil was a finite resource, the easy oil would eventually run out, we would be left with this concentration of oil that would be in strong hands in the Middle East and Russia, and at that time, all of us in energy economics did countless papers, including some of us on this panel and many of us in the audience, on OPEC market power. And the idea was that OPEC markets power was going to get stronger and stronger over time, and what do we need to do in the developed economies to counter that? And the interesting thing about going backwards in time and thinking about that mindset, especially for the younger scholars here, is that now the focus from that scarcity paradigm meant that every major oil and gas company strategy was about identifying reserves for growth in the future and positioning themselves for growth. And if you were in OPEC, it was either making sure you had those resources that would be available down the road, or actually there was a lot of players that felt they would hoard their resources under the ground because if they would produce them now, they wouldn't get the full value of the resource, so they would want to produce the resource later after the easy oil disappeared. And of course, that's turned out to be a very bad strategy now that we can kind of see the energy transition, especially for natural gas. And so now, what is the strategy that companies are pivoting to as a result to this new landscape? And, one element of the new landscape, which is sort of a burgeoning area of finance literature, which I've been writing on and, find infinitely interesting, is this question of stranded asset risk. Will there be stranded assets? If they are, what would be the nature of them? Where would they be located? How does that affect a country like Saudi Arabia or Russia in their current thinking and strategy? And so stranded asset risk on the front line in the activist community is about getting the big companies like the oil majors, two of whom are here with me, and Eirik, I think, is particularly uniquely situated because Norway has announced that it's going to restrict its investments in certain kinds of oil and gas companies, more on the shale side, but still cautious about the risks and volatility that's involved in investing in oil. And so that raises an interesting question. How is that already affecting the the stock price of oil and gas companies on, say, the New York Stock Exchange? And I did a paper with a colleague at UC Davis a few years ago where we looked at the first scientific article that came out on this concept of unburnable carbon, and we found that actually the stock market value, teasing out, other factors, that you could actually attribute that science article to a 2% loss in the value of 63 American oil and gas companies in the 2-week window around the time the science was published and reported. Moving forward, we now know, and this is something that's being debated a lot in the sort of stranded assets dialogue around Wall Street and pension funds, is that oil company capitalization as a percentage of the Fortune 500 companies is actually half today what it was 10 years ago. It used to run around 8 to 10%. It's now around 4%. And so people question, is this part of the stranded asset story? And or is it temporary because oil prices look particularly bad this year? And that raised the question in my mind about, if we look at the U.S. coal industry, which has been dramatically decapitalized, their CapEx went from $62 billion in 2007 to $4 billion the month before Trump was elected, and it's recovered to about $8 billion now, but we're continuing to see bankruptcies. What would happen geopolitically if the majors got decapitalized? What if Shell couldn't access public markets for capital? It might be able to get money from private markets, but what would that look like? And if the majors reduce their investment in oil and gas exploration, where would it land? So I think one of the theses is that if private oil companies, the shale companies, independents, the majors, had less capital to deploy into oil and gas, ironically, that would leave the world much more dependent on national oil companies. Might bring us back to a time when we thought we've now solved that problem of our high dependence on national oil companies. And that brings me back to thinking about the performance of national oil companies, something that I've written a lot about, and Morgan's written a lot about, and Andreas has written a lot about. And we're seeing these trends among national oil companies. We have problems with anti-corruption campaigns that are flagging the sort of management teams of the national oil companies and making it harder for them to concentrate on core business. We're seeing social disintegration in some of the societies where national oil companies played an important role both in employment and in providing capital to the state. And as these national oil companies are threatened by social expectations, it becomes sort of a self-fulfilling loop where we starting to worry about stranded assets and the long-term outlook for oil. The Economist magazine, cover this week is something like the end of oil or some phrase like that. So if you're living in a national, in a petro state, if you're in Nigeria or you're in Colombia or you're in the Gulf countries, our expectations of society now at tension with the fact that this oil revenue that you thought was going to be there for future generations and you were saving it for that is actually not going to be available, and budgets are going to be under more and more pressure over time. So the pressure is actually to take money out of the National Oil Company. Like, it's no longer a rainy day fund. Now it's we need to use it now. Now it's a credit card for today. And so you're getting sovereigns borrowing against the account of the national oil companies. You're getting sovereigns actually taking the money out of the national oil companies. You're getting national oil companies that can't make new investments in resources because their money has to be, the national treasury, contribution national treasury has to be used on social spending and other priorities. You're getting the Saudi Aramco IPO where we're trying to monetize, and ADNOC also is an IPO where we're trying to monetize our assets today to get the money out of the ground today for my future asset resource. So all of those things mean that the question about whether national oil companies will actually be available to provide the oil that's needed in the medium to long term also has to be called into question. And one has to think about it because even in the IEA's aggressive sustainable development goal modeling, it shows 64 million barrels a day of oil demand for 2040. So it's not like there's going to be no demand for oil. The way people talk about the energy transition, there's always this thinking, the way it's expressed, as if we're going to zero, but we're not going to zero. So I think that those are sort of particularly interesting issues for our community to think about. How would we model those? How would we study those? There's sort of, I think, a rich body of topics for the research, as we say, when we can't quite pin it down in our model for the first journal article. And but let me add to this last thing. One of the manifestations of this, besides some of these national oil company actions that I've described today, is that when the Trump administration set out to strengthen sanctions against Russia and Iran, the ease at which they did that was a bit shocking. I mean, it was much easier to do it this time around than even under President Obama or past administrations. And that might seem surprising to people on one level because this hasn't been an administration that's been very alliance-oriented. And so, trying to be tactful. And so because of that, you might have expected they would have more pushback and resistance to sanctions. And I would contend that it's not because, art of the deal, it's because people care less about whether or not they're going to maintain access to certain natural gas fields or certain oil fields in these countries. If you look at the landscape of companies that might have invested in Venezuela in the past, now that the surface equipment and some of the reservoirs have been destroyed and they were complex small fields, it could be that going forward, large oil companies won't be that interested in going back into Venezuela. And so if you're asking me to comply with sanctions, I'm not lobbying my government to resist that because in the end I'm not really interested in investing there. I might argue that that's also true in Iran, right? That companies have been pushed in and out of Iran several times. There's geopolitical risk in Iran. Some of the deals that companies had were not all that attractive structurally in terms of how their contracts rewarded them. And so if you're pushing me out of a condensate field for natural gas in Iran and you're Total, I hope this doesn't offend anybody from Total, maybe the government's doing you a favor to take you out of that investment because we have a surplus of condensate in the market. So it's an easier lift. But now let's look at it the flip side. I'll end my remarks because I know I'm taking a long time, but just this one last point. Now I'm Iran and I'm Russia. And I'm feeling that the ease at which the United States can impose sanctions on me is much easier, much smoother than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. And that I would contend that is because of companies' strategic rethinking about what assets they want to own and what long-term assets they're willing to invest in. And I'm feeling this loss of power because I'm used to coming to an international conference And to be crass, people from the corporate side are following me everywhere I go to talk to me about oil field investment, and all of a sudden I'm going to the same international conference and no one's following me around at all, and there's sanctions on me. You can just feel the loss of power on a visceral level. Besides the fact that you're not able to express it on a geopolitical level in your dialogue for diplomacy. And I would contend that having experienced that loss of influence, that you're seeing these countries resort to what we call in Washington harder power. They're more apt to act militarily. They're more apt to try to assert their interests through asymmetric warfare. We're seeing the quote-unquote attacks on the Saudi oil industry. You could see it in that context that Iran feels this loss of power, and it's reasserting its influence by saying, you can't ignore me, you can't just forget about my oil, I can have leverage over all the oil in the entire Middle East through military means, and you can't just ignore the fact that you don't need my particular oil. And you could kind of see the Russians hacking into European elections and the United States campaigns, and you could see Russia with its military campaign into Syria, in much the same context, which is you might not think you need my oil and gas in the same way, and you might think that in Europe, for example, it's not just U.S. LNG, because that tends to be proselytized here in the United States. It's actually more that the more Europe goes to renewable energy, the less pressure there is to have natural gas from Russia. And so you're feeling this loss of power and you're asserting it militarily. And I would say that the robust military buildup in Saudi Arabia and the UAE and their assertive foreign policies would also fall into that bailiwick. So I leave you with that thought that part of the geopolitics of the transition is not about how these supply chains that are part of new energy is going to influence relations among countries. I mean, that's going to be important, but maybe the bigger overriding immediate crisis is going to come from what happens for the quote-unquote losers as they move forward trying to assert their continued place in the global power spectrum.
Terrific comments. Thank you, Amy. So I was remiss in not properly introducing this panel, given that it's a fairly abrupt change from the last discussion. So we, 3 of the 4 of the people on this, of the speakers, do not live in the United States. We are not going to focus on the United States to a large degree, and so I should have given you that at the start, so I apologize. But Amy, those are terrific comments, and we have our first administration joke already under our belt, which is great. I'm going to ask Wim Thomas to give his comments. I've known Wim for a very long time. He is the Chief Energy Advisor at Shell, which is a terrific title, which means sort of international man of mystery at Shell. And Wim has been a key part in the energy dialogue for many years, and we'll look forward to your comments. Wim, thanks for being here.
Yes, thanks, Morgan. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yep. Great. Yes, so I just thought to take a few slides, just to, sometimes a picture speaks 1,000 words, as they say, and about the geopolitics of energy transition, and really go to energy transition, and maybe to make a bridge, or I have one or two bridges with Amy already, and I think one statement I would like to make, and I'm not going to prove it here, but I just make the statement, but in my view, the success of shale oil and gas in the United States have postponed the world energy transition by at least a decade. So think about that, right? That's the resource curse in other ways, you could argue, which perspective you have. Well, the future is very uncertain, and no one really knows it. We all know that, of course, and our company actually uses scenarios already for 50 years to do that. Just a very quick introduction. I'm going to say a little bit on the sky scenario, which is a well below 2 degrees scenario. this scenario is not a planning scenario for us. It is a scenario to stretch the mindset of our decision makers, to make them uncomfortable and really say, hey guys, is your policies really, or your strategy or your vision really that robust for the future? And could you not make it a bit more resilient, please? Because we have ESG shareholders knocking on our door and say, you need to do something. So that is actually the introduction of this slide of American lawyer Franz, who says we don't know the future. I just have 3 slides for you, so don't worry about it. It won't be too long. But there's some placeholders in the back. You can look at the leisure side. But first, we postulated a while ago that we are entering an era of transitions. And we said an era because it is about 10 years more, and transitions, there are many more transitions than just the energy transition. I would argue it is basically in demographics from west to east. It's followed by economic prosperity, and then it's followed by political exertion of power. That follows. And we're just in that phase over where you see China flexing its muscles, although it says it wants to have a peaceful rise, but all the things are there. Amy just said something about an loss of power, sense of power, and people want to exert their power on via different platforms. And one of these platforms is digitalization, is technology. One is another. That's a whole era of complete change, and we can't hardly imagine how that's going to look like. So how actually our companies work, our industry works, but also how society is going to make decisions. You may not think about it, but probably your free will is actually pretty programmed in by the time you think you make a free choice, when you have the digitalization going into force. And also there's another transition, and that's actually the societal awakening that actually human activity does stretch our planetary boundaries. And at the moment we only actually the CO2 issue really come to the forefront. But there are a few other planetary boundaries coming to the edge, and we'll see more and more of these societal waves and pressures with people saying they're not happy there, what's happening. So the energy transition is really captured in this picture here. This is the CO2 emissions of our sky scenario. It's a well below 2 degree scenario. If you do loads of nature-based solutions, it's a 1.5 degree scenario, even with a little bit of overshoot, but we come back to that. And this actually, we think, is a technical possible scenario and an economically affordable scenario. That is something else, is the lowest cost, by the way. And that's, again, straight away a domestic political problem if it's not the lowest cost. But what you see here is actually the bottom colors, the kind of pink, blue, and then the purple. That's the developed world. That's the 1.25 billion people of the OECD, actually, and the other ones, the 5.8 and the non-OECD. The red is China. The first 3 actually lines, you see the CO2 emissions coming down. It's a natural, competitive process, like Bill just said here in the front right. It's just market forces going to take place, and it's going to happen in this part. But what happened really? And I think China is a very good, the red bars is a very good example. Just think what happened between 2000 and 2010. That's when the world started outsourcing its heavy industry and manufacturing base to China. And China used coal-fired power stations to fuel that. So we did very well, but actually we exported our emissions. So the orange afterwards is India. That should be the next powerhouse, also 1.3 billion people coming afterwards. But you see, they are not, at least in this projection, have this similar CO2 timeline. And that's because we assume that India and all the other emerging economies are going to leapfrog in technology, taking the best available technologies in efficiency and CO2 reductions, so that they don't do what we did in the past. Big assumption, but of course here's already a kind of geopolitical equity game playing on, and how we're going to play that. Because when we go for stringent measures at home, are we going to outsource our jobs as well as the CO2? I would like to really sketch the energy transition. And this is actually a picture from an end consumer perspective. So this is not oil, gas and all this stuff what you normally see. This is actually electrons. That's a big yellow blob on the bottom. And then we have the red pinkish, the blue and the bluish. That's natural gas. Sorry, it was liquid hydrocarbon fuels or oil. And then the natural gas, the gaseous fuels, and above is the solids. And maybe the first conclusion you can see is that we still probably have to more or less double, well, that's in primary energy, this is slightly less in TFC, in total final consumption. But all these energies still remain till the end of the decade. But we're going to decarbonize them. A lot of these molecules, right, will be used in petrochemicals, etc. But the first conclusion is we can't do everything with electrons. So when we talk about enormous stretching targets of 50%, maybe 100% renewables, yes, that's the power sector. And the power sector only being 20% of today's energy use. And that has to triple. So if you push in each of the sectors, buildings, transport, and industry, as much electrons as you can do, you probably can use the whole energy system globally around 50 to 60% with electrons. So that's that part covered. But we still need molecules, what I already said, for petrochemical industry, but also for the hard-to-abate sectors like cement, steels, heavy-duty transport, aviation, trucking, and shipping. So what do you do with that? Coming back to the yellow blob, that's electricity. This is an incredible increase of a rate. Over a period of 20, 30 years, we have to triple our efforts. Governments have to stimulate supply being ahead of demand. And at the same time, they have to enforce that the demand sectors, us, right, are going to change our houses to basically net zero energy, fully electrified. We all drive electric cars by 2030 in this part of the world. There's no choice, by the way, and the rest of the world by 2050 in this scenario. Just think about that. What an incredible acceleration is required. Because an energy transition took normally about 3 generations, 50 years. This has to happen in 1 generation, 50 years. And we're going from 80% fossil to 80% non-fossil. And that actually, of course, implications to the major resource holders, like Amy just said, so I'm not going to repeat that. But intrinsically, most of the renewables are domestic resources. So a whole different power play in energy security is going to play out. And of course, there's a political problem about who is going to pay for it in the short term. Now, another thing you don't see on this picture is a dotted line which should be on top, and that is 40% of the energy we're not going to use because we're going to be so efficient. Now, the IEA just published today its annual efficiency report and says actually efficiency improvement is decelerating. You know, it needs to be about 3% a year and it's decelerating. So it's going the opposite way. Really very worrying because that means we will probably, with today's investments of oil and gas around 600 billion, is really good investment level for a sustainable development scenario for a 2 degrees world. But if you then look at the other part of the equation, is renewables then investing enough for the 2 degrees world? The answer is no. The renewable industry invests for the business as usual world, while the oil and gas industry paradoxically already invests for the 2 degrees world. So probably not too much stranded assets in our side, but there might be some price spikes on the way. Because let's face it, an energy transition will be very uneven. For major resource holders, if these NOCs are not going to invest, we will see some price volatility in the old energies, and we still have to invent a continuous electricity system with 100% renewables. Quite a few challenges here, and I go really through it with 7 miles boots, as they say. But I'd just like to say a little bit, I don't know what that is, I'll just close it. From an IUC's perspective, this is not a very daunting world. This is actually a very exciting world. Because look where we are, right? I mean, right, so we produce fuels to our end consumers. and the fossil feedstock will have to become renewable feedstock. Yeah, big deal. That's a 50-year period we can do so. And if you look at our capital stock turnover, that's every 15, 20 years max. So we have about 2.5 cycles to do that. So if this is going ahead, right, as an IOC, if you really believe you have deep pockets, you have top-class people, you have the innovation in-house, right, this is a world full of opportunity. So even if you stay in your own space, because the molecular side of the system is not going to change, it's not going to shrink much, it's not going to grow, you still have a very good future there. And then, of course, the big question, certainly for companies like us, do we want to ignore that other exciting new play, 50% of the market be electrons? And that is really a question. Now, just to round off, one slide is that is a lot of different measures required to decarbonize. And our company has been in the forefront foot. We have really said, look, we don't only want to decarbonize our scope 1 and 2, basically on their own control, but also the emissions, the 85% of the other emissions from our customers will burn the fuel. Because if we can't provide a fuel which is decarbonized throughout the value chain, then it's not good enough. So when you see this target, so 20% reduction by 2035 and 50% by 2050, that means scope 1, 2, and 3. So we acknowledge that we can't just say our responsibility, IOC, is just the 4, we just give you the fuel and then good luck with it, the rest is your problem. No, we also have to give that solution all the way to the end use, otherwise it's not good. We need to, you see, actually, this is about, it's a quite nice schematic, but say, okay, operational efficiency, everyone talks about, well, yes, nice, thickness of the line. Gas shift, good stuff, especially when we replace coal, but it's not the end of it. Renewable power, obviously, that is a big thing. Biofuels, but there are some technology developments still to be had. Electric mobility, really to change out, what type of fuel you use is really the big game. And then you have CCS, carbon capture and storage. It's still modest, but it's still required in this world, because actually the world is going to overshoot its CO2 emissions, and therefore via the biomass loop, you have to capture that CO2 and put it back under the ground. And again, I believe that our industry is part of the solution there. It's not just go away and we will do it ourselves. We are that part of the solution. And then finally see nature-based solutions. Actually, I would like to call it the Biosphere Restoration. We need to do that anyway as the world, right? We have been letting deforestation and land degradation going far too far. So it does two ways. It does actually good for the habitat and the globe, but also then it will be a carbon sink. So a few of these measures which are required, they're all required. You can't really say, well, one or not. But I think this is really an exciting time, and it is something our industry could really play a very important role in it. So I would say as we also maybe be seen as part of the problem now, but we also have to be part of the solution. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Wim. We're starting off well. I apologize to the other chairs of other sessions, as this one's going to be the most interesting, but we thought we would start that way. Thank you, Marianne. I'm going to ask Eirik Waerness from Equinor. He is the chief economist in Equinor and has a senior vice president title as well. He is enjoying coming back to Colorado time and again, and I hope we can continue that tradition. Equinor, many of you know about Equinor, and used to be called Statoil, but it's a really interesting company to see how they're adjusting to the energy transition. They're sort of a mix between a national oil company and has some private aspects too. So Eirik, looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me out here. I thought I would deviate a little bit from the script, saying I want to talk about geopolitics and the energy transition, and not only geopolitics of the energy transition. I think the current geopolitical climate that we're observing is not at all conducive to addressing climate change and the need for an energy transition, to put it mildly. And an efficient energy transition, if it is to happen, it should deliver on climate targets, and that require cooperation, trust, common solutions, efficiency, and financing. Now that requires a very different geopolitical climate than what we're experiencing today. Continued conflicts and lack of trust, polarization, trade wars, bigger than neighbor policies, zero-sum attitudes, what I gain, you lose. That will make it extremely difficult to ensure delivery of all sustainable development goals, including the 3 that were highlighted in the Paris Agreement on attacking climate change, delivering energy to everyone, and eradicating poverty. If you don't have energy access, we cannot solve the poverty problem either. So I think if we don't have conducive geopolitics, there is a risk we won't have any energy transition. And we see also that the traditional geopolitical hotspots of the world in terms of energy and oil and gas continue to be there and play a role. And Amy mentioned Venezuela, that's a clear example. We also see the discussions now about the new gas pipeline from Russia into Europe, and so regional geopolitics also play a role in our energy future. Then, geopolitics of energy transition, pointed out by many researchers and others, including the IRENA Commission that I was privileged to be part of last year. There's reason to believe that the energy transition, if it happens, if and when it happens, itself will affect geopolitics. It will entail loss of importance for current important fuels, and therefore loss of power for the fuel owners. It will lead to increased access to energy, increased efficiency. Going to electricity is smart. That leads to affordability and opportunities for a lot of people. Less monopoly power on scarce resources, but also new interdependencies and new sources of geopolitical influence, potentially conflict. Things like both regional power in electricity markets. Germans don't have to rely on Russian gas anymore, but they have to rely on Spanish power, solar power, or Italian, and also on key minerals. And then, of course, the question is, which Amy also alluded to, was will the shift itself in that type of transition, will it be smooth or affected by conflict, and will the losers of that type of development accept their loss or try to slow the process? And as part of that, how do we finance the transition to ensure that we have a smooth transition? Who's going to pay for it? Also, the energy transition, even if it's going ultimately to be successful, will entail a period of radically shifting prices, increased costs, lack of alternatives for periods as well for users of energy. And that causes frustration. And we witness that now in France. We witness it even in Norway. We now have a single-issue anti-toll road party doing a very good local election in some of the key cities in Norway. And we witnessed it in Ecuador just some weeks back, when the government, in agreement with IMF, tried to remove fossil fuel subsidies, and see what happens when climate policies starts to bite. So higher costs for vital services are unpopular. Another example in that line is what's happening in Chile and causing now the COP25 to be moved to Spain. Right? So even if the transition itself carries with it the potential for lower geopolitical conflict levels, if the transition takes place in a period of high levels of conflict, as it is now, lack of political credibility for our leaders, frustrations about inequality, which is one of the reasons why we have the LOS in Paris, job losses, etc., the transition can also fuel new conflicts. So the interplay between geopolitics and the energy transition is therefore enormously complex. On the other hand, the energy transition, it requires, I think, a low level of geopolitical conflict, and it also contributes to dampening the levels of conflict overall. Generally, it will do that. But the geopolitical situation that we have now slows down the energy transition and actually exacerbates some of the challenges that that would be caused by the transition. And the transition is an enormous challenge. We need to satisfy demand for energy, which is what Wim pointed out to, while using all possible levers to reduce emission intensities at the same time. And I can say that in Norway now, as an example, we're the extreme example. We have year-to-date close to 50% of new car sales being electric, and it's reached 9% of the car fleet in Norway now, electric vehicles. But we don't see the reduction in gasoline demand yet. It's happening right now. So what it has done, it's just it's cut the rise in underlying energy demand, and that's in a very mature economy where oil demand generally doesn't increase. So it serves to show that delivering more energy while reducing emissions is an enormous challenge. And we need to develop solutions that are not yet known. Carbon capture and storage, electricity storage, demand management systems, new market regulations. What's the electricity price going to be when 50% of electricity is produced with something with zero marginal cost? There was 140 hours of negative electricity prices in Germany last year. That's a terrible investment signal for somebody who wants to go in and put a solar facility in place, right? So market regulations. We're going to have new extraction of minerals at massive scale compared to what we are doing now. New large-scale infrastructure, both electricity grids and other types of stuff. And we have to build new nuclear electricity. Otherwise, we can't get there in terms of lowering the emissions. And mistakes will be made while we do that. Resources wasted. Things we think will work that won't work. So it's naive, I think, to believe that that will happen without conflicts. And therefore, it's even more important that we are able to put ourselves in a situation now where there is a low level of conflict and high level of trust, so that we're in a much better position to deal with those conflicts when and when they arise. Thank you.
All right. Terrific stuff. Thank you, Eirik. I was also remiss, I didn't tell you my name, but it's on the list. My name's Morgan Bazilian. I'm a professor at a local public university here called the Colorado School of Mines. In any case, my friend Andreas C Goldthau here, who is a professor of international relations at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy, and I and several colleagues from Germany published a paper about winners and losers in the energy transition this morning, or it came out this morning. So, Andreas, let's hear about those different curves. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Morgan, and thanks very much for for having me. The slide says 5th of November. I think I just got lost in time zones, but oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. So, you know, the Europeans are pretty much kind of proud of what they have done so far when it comes to the energy transition. And well, the present administration here makes their job a lot easier in being proud of what they have done, they think. And particularly the Germans, you know, they have been spreading the gospel of their global Energiewende left, right, and center. But turns out what they have not been very good at is thinking about the geopolitical implications of that global Energiewende and what it might actually do to countries that are, well, currently fossil fuel producers, but also the ones that might actually, you know, be on the receiving end of the molecules or electrons going forward. So what they did is they put together a group of people, including Morgan and myself, that was the German Foreign Ministry, and asked them to think a little bit about, hopefully smartly, about the way forward. And so what I'd like to present is the 4 scenarios that we came up with on the future when it comes to the global energy transition and geopolitics. Now, in essence, they look like that. And I'll walk you through the details in a minute, but essentially what they're after is all the things that we already talked about. They're after 4 drivers in the end. One is policies, or global policies. The second is national politics, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Technology has been mentioned, so that goes right into it, and the role that markets play. Now, a lot depends, obviously, on how you think about those drivers and what is actually in the driver's seat. So the first scenario that we thought that may be a plausible, if not necessarily likely, but plausible scenario is what we call the big green deal scenario. In the end, it looks like that. So what you get is fossil fuels leaving the system at some point, in the beginning of the mid-20s, early 30s, renewables come in, and what it probably looks like is it comes pretty close to the sky scenario that we have heard about. In a way, it's a brave new world. How does that world come about? Well, you got a big global policy push. So policy is the big driver here, mainly centering on the G20. Further need of action, providing a clear path towards net zero. And that essentially gives a clear-cut policy signal, not only to the governments out there and state-level legislators, but also industry and the finance sector. So what you get is a massive reallocation of capital in the financial markets, and they flock into low-carbon firms, capitalize them, and essentially get them right up into the Fortune 500. Now, as part of the global policy push, you also have a very generous climate fund, and that's with a view of the problem that Amy talked about. How do you deal with the petrostates that lose part of their revenue going forward? So that gives them a soft landing and avoids a last-ditch effort to flood the world with cheap oil and gas. And in the end, what you get is a big learning curve in technology, massive deployment, and a wave of green globalization, which is even, which means all countries share in the benefits of decarbonization, even the countries that are on the lagging side of things when it comes to low carbon technology. So in terms of geopolitics, just to wrap that up and wrap up the first scenario, in terms of geopolitics, you get very low friction arising from that scenario. You get a just transition, the SDGs that have been talked about already, they are achieved. In the end, this is a brave new world kind of scenario. Now, take the global policy consensus out and put technology in. You get a very different, as a driver, you get a very different scenario. You get a technology breakthrough. It is a scenario that would still give a steep learning curve and a big role to renewables. Fossil fuels will leave the system, though not at a level that you have in the green and the big green deal scenario. Why is this? Well, it is because that technology breakthrough doesn't happen across the world, it happens in some places. You have the technology innovators in the end taking the lead. That's the US and mainly China. For two reasons. They're big markets.